I'd like to welcome everybody to our AAFLFC podcast. I have honored guests with me today, Josee Vachon, uh, singer and songwriter, Joseph Dunn, tourism professional, French language activist, and former director of Code de Fil, and Jesse Martineau, the creator and the host of the FCL, French Canadian Legacy blog. And Jose, I'd love to start with you and hear about really your French heritage, your the heritage of your family, your story.
Okay. Well, I'm an immigrant. I was born in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec. Both my parents grew up in Quebec nearby. My mother was from the Beauce region. My father was American born, just on the Maine border in Moosehead, Maine, where my grandfather worked at the time. But then when he was two, they moved back to Lac-Mégantic. I was when because of my father's work, we moved actually to Central Maine when I was 7 years old. So that's where I started speaking English through real full immersion, being put in a small town. But my mother had one condition on following him to Central Maine. She knew it was important for us to see our father every other day by moving to Central Maine. But she said, I will only move there if I can spend my entire summers back in Lac Mégantic. So it was an amazing experience for my brother and I because we suddenly had 2.5 months of full immersion in Quebec every summer with my 14 cousins and my friends. And we had great family parties, campfires on the beach. Every holiday is what you'd expect, in French Canada, from, eating tourtière and baked beans and sugar pie to Saint Jean Baptiste celebrations in June. I really got to experience everything that Quebec does during the summer, from June to September when we would come back, literally the day before school started. My mother was very serious about this. And she also never, we spoke French to her growing up only. So my brother, who was only two, was able to speak French to this day. I didn't learn to read or write French, however. We moved to Maine. I was 7 years old, so it was I had already done first grade in Quebec, but they put me back in first grade when I moved because they were afraid that they would take too long or it'd be too difficult. I don't think second grade would have been that intense, but usually it's a repeat of first grade, right? To just kind of, but it was, I guess it was helpful in many ways too. Let's see. I
Jose,
told, yes,
If we could perhaps have Joseph jump in
sure.
and tell us a little bit about the French heritage of his family.
Hi there. Well, so I'm all the way down in the bottom part of the United States at the end of the Mississippi River in New Orleans. And so it's fascinating hearing these Franco-American stories from the Northeast and then comparing sort of those experiences with what has happened here in Louisiana, because there have been French people here since 1699. My ancestors arrived here from France in the 1720s, so really sort of
Wow.
at the beginning of the colonial period. And even though I grew up in a fully English speaking household because I have a maternal ancestor who was the last in the family who spoke French a few generations before I did, I was exposed to this Louisiana culture in French and in the Creole language as well, very, very young through family friendships and connections and things like that. And even though I didn't speak French as a little boy, I heard it and I wanted it. So I made the conscious effort from the time I was 8 or 9 to find anything that I could that had to do with the French language or French in Louisiana, and was just really the nerdy kid seeking out anybody who
Awesome.
could talk French to me, and sort of began picking it up when I was a very little boy. So yeah, even though I have that French heritage genealogically and in the bloodline. I wasn't immersed in it like you guys up in New England were, because generationally for lots of us in Louisiana, it's further removed than it is for you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Joseph. That is interesting. It's true. We are three people from the Northeast here. I just realized that. And yourself. So thank you. Jesse, tell us about your family's French heritage.
Sure. So I'm from Manchester, New Hampshire. Both my parents from New Hampshire also grew up speaking French in the house, which their generation was super, super common. My grandfather on my dad's side, it was actually from Quebec, Saint Apollinaire, Quebec, near Quebec City is the town he was from. But every other branch of the family tree also from Quebec, just one or more generations further back at that point. But yeah, I grew up, I mean, me and my sister, and this is something that I'm still trying to remedy. I'm unfortunately not as successfully as Joseph so far, but me and my sister are the first generation in our family to not speak French, which is something that obviously that we're not super excited about and trying to do something about currently. But yeah, it was just something that was always around. When we had family get-togethers, both sets of grandparents would always be there. That generation would only talk to each other in French, so you couldn't be around like a Thanksgiving or a Christmas or somebody at the table. They're all speaking to each other in French. I was baptized at a church at the time that was labeled a French church, Saint George, here in Manchester, kind of the same thing. So it was the presence. I mean, similar to the foods, the pork pie. I was the kid sent to elementary school with a gâteau sandwich when I was a kid. So it's just one of those things that was kind of just always around.
That's very interesting. Three such really unique experiences. But now I'd like to ask you, Jose, what has been the impact of your French heritage on your life?
For me,
I know, not an easy question.
No, but it has been. First of all, I think immersion was a strong impact. It affected me a lot. When we arrived, very difficult at the beginning, and yet it helped me learn English. Within 3 months. I all through school I didn't realize how many French names of surnames were in our town, because it's not something when you're growing up that you're interested in until you really get to college, I think. Unlike Joseph, I guess, who knew from the beginning. But I all through school I found that I was always different in some ways, but it also gave me confidence. In many things, I was asked to help local tourists who were lost, from Canada, and somebody would say, "Oh, we have a somebody here in town," and so my parents and I, but they seemed to often send me to help out. I ended up going to college and discovered that I was able to do translating work for French foresters who were buying land and wanted to manage the European way. And so that was very cool to be able to translate in the woods with foresters. And the first time we saw a moose, and the French were like, "An elk." I go, "Nope." I said, "Un orignal." And they were just shocked that other things. I became a singer by accident because just from working at a French newspaper on campus. The next thing I know, there was word of mouth that I could come and do school assemblies or library concerts. And then when I realized that there was this niche of lacking, I sort of went in that direction, even though I planned on being a French high school teacher. That got scrapped once I realized that I really could do this and I also ended up hosting over 500 episodes of a French cable TV show. So French has always been, a huge impact in my life, definitely, without expecting it.
That is really a remarkable and wonderful story, Jose. Joseph, what has the impact of your French culture been on your life?
Oh goodness, how do I even begin to answer that question? I can't extricate myself from that. I can't imagine any part of my existence without the French language or Louisiana French and Creole culture in there somewhere. It's the food, it's the music, it's all of those things that when I work in the tourism world, and I'm always fascinated to see how people respond and react to this place, because there's so much of that I realize that I can't see, hear, or do for the first time. I can never hear jazz in the music, jazz in the street for the first time. I can never walk through the French Quarter for the first time. I can never eat gumbo for the first time. I can't experience those things that are so intrinsically part of who I am, in the same way that other people can. So I try, sometimes I'm kind of sometimes living vicariously through other people in the way that they experience Louisiana and Louisiana French culture and even language. So it's so intrinsically part of me that I can't even tell you to what extent it affects me, because I don't know how to imagine my life without it.
Exactly.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Joseph. Jesse, now I know each one of you had a very different story of your French heritage, but how has that French heritage impact? I'm looking at behind you, New England and the Quebec Fleur-de-Lis. How has that heritage impacted your life?
Sure. Well, a huge part of my life now. I will confess, I spend more time doing, hopefully my boss isn't paying attention, but I spend way more time working on telling the Franco-American story than I do my own job at this point, this point in my life, for sure. But to me right now was super exciting. For me, it's a community. I've learned a ton, met a bunch of just amazing people, being able to connect with different organizations that are doing tremendous work. I mean, like Joseph said, it's kind of one of those things that's always around, so I don't know what it would have been without it. But just the opportunities I've had, the people I've met, the things I've been able to learn, COVID permitting, I'm going to be heading up in a couple of months to Quebec City. I was supposed to do it last year, but hopefully COVID permitting, I'll be spending my 6 months up in Quebec, so that when I return, I can finally talk to my folks in their first language. Something obviously I've wanted to do for a very long time. So, but yeah, I mean, just this, it's really awesome. Just for me, it's fun because every once in a while I'll come across things, especially when I was doing the podcast, and it's like, you mean not everybody grew up eating Chinese pie for dinner all the time? Like, I had no, just these little random stuff like that you had no idea were specific to your culture. You just kind of assumed it was either super unique just to your family or was something that everybody did. And then you find out that some of the stuff that you just kind of never even thought about, took for granted, were actually part of this much larger, way fun picture. It's been super exciting.
I love the way that the French, your French heritage, excuse me, has impacted your lives. I mean, really, 3 very inspirational stories. I have one last question for you, and I'm hoping that people will be listening to us, and people will join us for subsequent conversations on that personal impact, that personal role of French heritage and French language in our lives in the U.S. And final question is, do you have a story you'd like to share? Either a story of yourself or a story of a family member when he or she first arrived in the U.S. A story of how that French heritage came into play.
Yeah, I have a hard time thinking of an actual story. I mean, my father, because we moved to the States late, for me, but since my father was American born and moved to Quebec when he was 2, I found it fascinating to find out that he was drafted in the U.S. Army when he was 18 and didn't speak English. And,
Wow.
and my grandfather said, no, you should go because you never know that you might want to live in the States someday. I don't want you to be a draft dodger. and my father was like, yeah. So he prepared learning English within like 6 months, but
Wow.
He said that he tells the story that he did it by with a dictionary and comic books and everything he could, and But he says, trust me, when the sergeant repeats something twice, you know what he's asking. And he said it was fascinating. He was not the only, I guess, immigrant or, someone living outside of the U.S. that had to go to, he lucked out. He didn't have to go to Korea. He was stationed in Germany at the time. But that I always found that to be an interesting story. For me, I guess my story is personal only because it was again immersion. I just remember my father telling me the first week when a friend wanted to meet me, and he'd say, "When you don't understand, just say these words: I don't understand," which of course went right over my head the minute she came over, and I'd go to her house and she'd go, wah, wah, wah. Everybody talked like the Charlie Brown teacher. That's what I do remember. I just hear wah, 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 wah. And the next thing I know, I would forget to say, I don't understand. I'd go, yes. And the mother would come upstairs and make a bologna sandwich. I hate bologna. So next thing I know, she'd say, we'd finish the sandwich, wah, 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 wah. The mother would come up and make a second sandwich because I said yes. It's like, no, no. But I do also remember the teacher saying, wah, 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 and I had no idea. But when she said something, coat, in Quebec, we often say un jacket, un coat, and it clicked. That was, I think, probably the first time I felt bilingual somehow. Wow. That it clicked. That's awesome. That she wanted me to hang my coat, and I was like, oh, finally, relief. But I feel for all the kids who arrive and go through this experience. I feel like if they can get English as a second language, I'm sure that it helps tremendously. Anyway,
Josee, that it's really such an inspirational story. Your father's and your own, in two very different ways. They're both wonderful stories. Thank you for sharing that. Joseph.
I love this question because it's a matter of perspective. None of my ancestors immigrated to the United States. They immigrated to a French colony. So Louisiana, after 1803, was recolonized by Americans. And so Americans to my ancestors were immigrants and foreigners in their former French colony. So, it's that what's fascinating to me about this whole experience with the French language is these different prisms and lenses that we can see ourselves and that we can see the space around us through, right? I understand the history of Louisiana so much more completely because I have French and Creole than I would if I were only speaking English, because all of the history that we learn about this space is really projected from an American English speaking perspective. And when we flip that paradigm, a lot of the history of Louisiana can actually be in opposition to the way that we learn about it in English. So, I would say that through trying to understand this through the eyes of my people who've been here again since the 1720s is always fascinating for me to think, okay, when they were seeing Americans coming in here and flooding in here, they weren't understanding them. And then I get, the British Irish piece that comes into Louisiana from the East Coast after 1803. I won't call it the Louisiana Purchase. I call it the Sale of Louisiana. Because again, it's that perspective, and it's that idea about, who controls the language is also controlling the historical and the contemporary narrative, and how I relate to that from both sides of who I am genealogically and historically, and through the different perspectives of these different people in my family, I just find fascinating. And it's a lot of fun to play with those opposing eyes and positions on how this story was developed.
Wow. Perspective is really a wonderful thing, and different perspectives are illuminating. Thank you, Joseph. Jesse.
Sure. The one thing I find fun that a lot of people are surprised by, especially from Manchester now, is stories my grandfather would tell of growing up on the West Side and being able to go months without hearing a single word of English here in West Manchester, or the fact that my great grandmother born in Manchester, lived her entire life in Manchester, never spoke English because she never had to. Just the fact that those kind of communities existed in this town that I'm in now is still super neat. And I guess the one thing that stuck out to me is the moment where I guess I started to realize how significant this language, this heritage was to my grandparents. Was I know when my grandmother, Meme Martineau, was dying, we had a chat and she told me she was going to make sure that her funeral was in English so that me and my sister understood, but she had to have Our Father in French. And that's something that has been all through my family.
Jesse,
Nice.
what a moving story.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today, but also for everything that you do every day on behalf of increasing understanding of French language and Francophone culture here in the United States. Look forward to many more wonderful conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
À la prochaine.
À la prochaine.
À la prochaine.
Merci, au revoir.
Au
À la
revoir.
prochaine. Au plaisir.